In the long hush after the world forgets a war, the air remembers the shape of violence as if it were a thing that left footprints. In that hush, the histories of two men and two forces braided into a single question: what wins when a principle meets a process? Bruce Banner once thought of himself as a machine with a single flaw, an unstable calculus in a brain that wanted order. Cain Marco always knew himself as a force with a single aim, an overbearing, immutable will baptized at the crimson altar of Cyttorak. Banner's origin was accident and the slow, aching refinement of guilt. Marco's birthright was grievance and the blunt blessing of a god curse. Both stories led to the same arena: bodies enlarged beyond human measure, wills stretched into archetype. The Hulk is not merely a man who became strong, he is a metaphysical problem made flesh, an engine that converts fear, pain and moral contradiction into escalating potential. Juggernaut is not merely a man who cannot be stopped. He is an enactment of immutability, an embodiment of an answer that refuses to entertain questions. That dialectic, becoming versus being, process versus essence, forms the quiet scaffold of what will become violence. Philosophers have argued for centuries whether permanence or flux is the ground of reality. The Hulk answers for flux. As rage accretes, boundaries dissolve, rules bend. The organism remakes its terms. Juggernaut answers for permanence, a pact with an external metaphysical patron that grants an almost ontological exemption from change. If the debate were purely metaphysical, both positions can be defended. A being that cannot be altered enjoys a kind of supremacy, while a process that can grow without bound threatens every fixed line. Yet the world of muscle and stone is a world of contingencies and contact. The crimson gem that anchors Cain to Cyttorak yields a miracle: invulnerability, ceaseless momentum, a will hardened into armor. It is a gift that makes Cain Marco an avatar. He is less man than manifestation, and that sameness in him is what gives him dread authority. The gamma in Bruce was a wound that taught adaptation. The Hulk's body is an engine that converts novelty into survival. Banner's intellect and Hulk's appetite for escalation make them a two-handed weapon. Banner sees patterns, Hulk breaks them. Banner remembers consequence, Hulk forgets to stop. When scholars argue about whether a law or an exception decides history, they seldom get to work with such blunt instruments. The stakes for this clash are not only territory or triumph, but ontology itself. Is the universe best ruled by a force that refuses decrement, or by a creature that can always increase its own decree? The practical answer will require circumspection. In past meetings, Juggernaut crushed defenses, turned heroes into kneeling witnesses, and left realities rearranged by impact. Hulk has been the avatar of a principle that grew until gods took him seriously, and legends revised their metaphor. Yet feats do not weigh the same. Juggernaut's triumphs are consistent, his ceiling high and steady. Hulk's are exponential but contingent on that most volatile of fuels, emotion. Philosophically, a steady high is strong if the contest is a sprint. An unbounded rise is decisive if time is a friend. The question the world will ask in the debris of the coming storm is whether rage, as an ontological category, can undermine the metaphysical contract that binds Cyttorak's power to Cain. Do gods concede to becoming, or do they carve their statutes into the bones of reality? There is another axis to the debate: purpose. Hulk's force is reactive and sometimes ethical. Banner's guilt transforms into an instinct to protect what remains. His fury is often a defense not merely of self, but of a fragile moral sense. Cain's force is acquisitive and absolute. He wants to dominate, to obliterate resistance, because the world refused him favor. When two metaphysical forces collide, purpose shapes how strength is deployed. A being whose power is feedback-driven becomes more dangerous when the need is clear. A being whose power is an imposition becomes more predictable. Prediction is not weakness, but it is a vector. It allows a process to find the angle of its growth against a fixed shape. Finally, there is the strange arithmetic of myth. Gods that gift absolute power rarely specify infinity. The crimson gem makes a man unstoppable. It does not in stories always confer the capacity to meet an indefinitely increasing force, whose nature changes the terms of engagement. Cyttorak granted an answer to violence. The Hulk grows new questions. Thus the stage sets itself. Two bodies approach a city emptied by fear, an old cathedral of stone and iron between them, its bells still able to sound a polity's astonishment. People have chosen sides in history. Some will worship the certainty of an unmovable force. Others will hope for the messy justice of a becoming that remembers. Inside Banner, the moral calculus has already tilted into a single aim: contain the Avatar before the world forgets itself underway. Inside Mako, the gem sings a litany of conquest and vindication. The argument will be settled not in courtrooms or treatises, but in impact and pressure, in the slow arithmetic of repeated contact, where potential can accrete into reality. Hulk's win is not a metaphysical inevitability, but a thesis. If a process can increase without bound, and if the enchantment anchoring an avatar responds to predicates the world did not account for, permanence will be eroded. That is the wager. Given time and enough reason to escalate, becoming will outgrow being. The city becomes the crucible, and both men the ore. The philosophers who dined on ideas will lean close. The poets will wait for the sound of the earth shifting its moral compass. When the first footstep of a colossus hits granite, the debate stops being theoretical and starts being a weather system. The world inhales, then holds, and then two thunderheads meet. The first keen note of violence is a ripple that turns into a drumbeat. Juggernaut's boots scar the avenue like tectonic plates shifting, and the pavement answers with heaved seams and vapor. He arrives like a sentence, relentless and simple, his helmet catching the light of a broken moon. The crimson gem embedded in his chest glows as though it hears its name. He moves without wind-up, a human tide that disregards anything in its path, and small things, cars, statues, the spent windows of a cathedral disintegrate where he passes. The Hulk comes with a different weather. It is slow at first, a human breath tightening into a gale, the quiet calculation of Banner folding into the irrepressible geometry of anger. He does not sprint, he becomes a single focused horizon. The city looks smaller against his shoulders. They meet at the heart of a square that was once for ceremonies and now will be a tribunal. Juggernaut strikes first because he always does. His fist is a boulder with intent, and when it lands the sound is a continent folding. Hulk takes it, and the impact is recorded in the way nearby glass turns to wind and the bones of the cathedral shudder. The first exchange is brute arithmetic. Blows traded like tacks, each landing with catastrophic certainty. Juggernaut's magic turns Hulk's skin into something less breakable than expectation. But Hulk's physiology feeds on every collision. Pain becomes fuel, strain becomes leverage. Banner's mind, when it surfaces between blows, measures and nudges. In the middle of a confrontation where limbs are fists and air is a weapon, Banner remembers structural weaknesses. The gem that anchors Kane is not the whole of the ritual. It is a node, a concentration. And nodes can be overloaded if the surrounding field is altered. Push enough current through a line and the breakers trip. Hulk amplifies instead of breaking. He guides his force not with language but with intention, nudging the momentum into patterns that force Juggernaut to expend his most sacred commodity. Absolute forwardness against resistance that is adaptive rather than static. For each time Juggernaut drives forward and breaks a block, Hulk does not merely take that energy, he uses it to grow. He catches an arm, rotates and lets the cuff of Juggernaut's momentum slam into a row of columns that by design were never intended to be slamming target. The columns collapse in a radial bloom, and the rubble becomes a new topology of contact. The gem hums and Cyttorak's whispered force writes a note of fury into Kane's bones, but the ritual that made him cannot anticipate a kind of force that transmutes space itself by being applied over and over. As the minutes become a geography of scars, Hulk's voice, a sound like an engine starting in a canyon, grows into a roar that is not mere noise but a nexus of intention. He is not only stronger, he is different. There are moments when Kane's helmets flicker with a reflected consideration. If the god's instrument makes you too consistent, Then creativity finds the seed. Hulk's adaptability blossoms into improvisation. He uses fallen girders to shorten Juggernaut's run, coaxes the attacker into arcs where momentum bends into friction instead of straight annihilation. Each time Juggernaut corrects, Hulk responds with a new permutation, and this multiplicity wears on the Avatar because his boon is tuned to a single operational genus: unstoppable impact. The law of diminishing returns eats at that law. The turning is not instantaneous. Juggernaut lands a strike that should have ended any lesser foe. The reverberation throws the city into a new topography of dust, and for an instant Hulk seems broken, a mountain with a crack. But Banner's calculus is the deep sea. The crack channels heat and the organism floods it with Ra. Where Juggernaut assumes immutable advantage, Hulk assumes growth. The argument of the first chapter, the philosophical thesis given flesh, shows here as method becoming as strategy. As Hulk's rage climbs, things that once confounded him become susceptible. Mystical edges that once slipped through his flesh begin to chatter when struck with the force of a being that has altered its own essence through sheer escalation. There's a lore in the marrow of myths that spirits lend their avatars certain certainties, and that certainties do not respond kindly to novelty that repeatedly violates their premise. The Crimson Gem sings, but it does not sing infinity. It sings a chorus designed to make a man unstoppable within a cosmos that assumed limits. Hulk, by contrast, is the accident that renames the cosmos. The decisive pivot arrives when Hulk recognizes that to win he must convert Juggernaut's greatest strength, momentum, into a liability. He becomes conductor. He threads his arms into the path of a charging Kane, but instead of resisting, he gives, bends and amplifies, redirecting the force through the ground so that the collision detonates under Juggernaut rather than at his chest. The earth itself tilts. The gem rattles. Cyttorak's blessing, which expects the simplest geometry of violence, encounters a topology it cannot read. Bruised and furious, Kane tries to reassert the linear theology of his power, drive forward, and Hulk meets him in the center of that theology and refuses the premise. He becomes not only stronger but conceptually larger, an embodiment of improvisation that uses the laws of physics as collaborators rather than constraint. The fight becomes a redefinition of what counts as a strike. Now a hit is also a question, and each answer unfolds into new possibility. Kane's rage is potent, his magic a deep river, but it is one river, and when Hulk floods the floodplain with persistent reshaping force, the river is driven into channels that dry. In a final catastrophic sequence, Hulk uses the rubble of the cathedral stone that once wore the names of saints as the instrument of metaphysical divorce. He tears through the chest where the gem sits, and the relic is a living thing, a node that thrums and screams and stabs its magic into the world. Hulk does not merely smash it, he unthreads it from the lattice of belief by applying an intensity of contact at successive angles, until the gem's voice stutters. The magic that makes Kane unstoppable is not a machine you can flip. It is a relation, and relations can be dissolved if the parameters change enough. The gem fractures, not in a glittering neat way, but in a way that resembles the slow unknitting of a sea. Kane collapses as the patron's voice wavers. Human anatomy reasserts itself with a savage, humiliating quickness. Where there was an avatar, there is at last a man, air hurt in his lungs, the weight of mortality not an abstraction but a pressing stone. Hulk stands over him like a verdict, and his final roar is both triumph and absolution. He does not revel in annihilation, but in the cessation of an imposed immutable cruelty. The philosophers who might have argued both sides of the problem could find satisfaction, being retained dignity in the narrowness of existence. Becoming had shown its potency when given time, ingenuity and moral aim. Bruce Banner, in the trembling after, remembers being human and understands why he had to become monstrous, not to dominate, but to reintroduce contingency into a world that had been treated as a fixed center. Kane Marco, stripped of Cyttorak's mantle, wakes to the small and ruinous truth of his choices. The city lives because the process outgrew the principle that would have stilled it. The winner is not simply the body that broke the other. It is the metaphysical argument that insisted the world may change. In that insistence, the Hulk is vindicated. A becoming that refuses to stop had finally been more absolute than a being that refused to change.